My name is Vera. I turned 28 this past March, and I was born and raised in a small town you won't find on most maps unless you know where to look. It sits quietly behind gray fields and forests of birch and pine, halfway between nowhere and the next place you'd rather not be. Most people here don't dream big, or if they do, they quickly learn not to say their dreams out loud. My whole childhood smelled like smoke from the factories and wet dirt from our tiny garden behind the house. I remember the sharp taste of cold tea with sugar lumps, the hum of my mother's old sewing machine, and the constant thud of my father's boots coming in after the night shift. Here, people measure worth by how steady your job is and how quiet your life stays. The more invisible you are, the better. But I was never good at being invisible. When I was 7, I made my first cake, if you could even call it that. A mess of stale cookies, boiled condensed milk, and too much sugar, stacked crookedly on my mother's best plate. I remember her face when she came home from work, a moment of genuine surprise before she scolded me for wasting food. But when I cut her a slice, she ate it anyway. My father grunted, said it was too sweet, then finished the rest while pretending he didn't like it. By the time I turned 15, I knew I didn't want to stand at the factory line. I didn't want to file reports in the cold hallways of the local administration either. My classmates laughed when I told them I wanted to make cakes, real cakes, beautiful cakes, cakes that looked like dreams and tasted like holidays. They said I'd grow out of it. They said there was no money in sweet things. They said it was cute. At 20, I moved out of my parents' house and rented a single room above an old grocery store. The walls were thin, the window looked out at the back alley, and I could hear the neighbor's TV through the peeling wallpaper. I worked during the day in a grim cafe that smelled like old oil and cheap coffee, and at night, I read recipes, watched videos, scribbled ideas into a worn notebook, and baked on a tiny second-hand oven I bought with borrowed money. Back then, my dreams were too heavy for my pockets. My mother called every evening. Her voice was always the same mix of worry and disappointment. "Vera, when are you coming back home? You need a real job. The factory is hiring again. You're not made for this city nonsense." Sometimes I lied and said I'd think about it. Sometimes I hung up before she could cry. When I finally quit the cafe to work for myself, the news spread through my family like wildfire. The next Sunday, my uncle Sergey came to my rented room, knocked on the door with his heavy fists, and sat on my broken chair like he owned the place. He smelled like stale cigarettes and cold wind. "Vera, what's this nonsense I hear? Cakes? What cakes? Go clean floors at the hospital, at least you'll get a salary. You'll starve here." I didn't argue. I offered him tea I couldn't afford and let him leave his cigarette butts in my chipped ashtray. He left shaking his head, muttering about how young people had gone soft. I wish I could say his words didn't sting, but they did. They burned. The neighbors in my old town whispered, too. They told my mother that I was lazy, useless, that I was living off her pension. That I'd come crawling back with my tail between my legs like all the other dreamers who tried and failed. Maybe they would have been right, if I hadn't been so stubborn. When my first online course flopped, I stayed up for 3 nights straight re-recording every lesson. When a client ghosted me after I delivered a birthday cake I'd spent 12 hours decorating, I cried into my pillow, then baked another one to photograph for my website. When my tiny oven broke, I borrowed my neighbor's kitchen in exchange for free pastries she could give her grandkids. For the first year, I barely made enough to pay rent. I wore the same coat for 3 winters. My hands cracked from constant washing, and my throat ached from recording videos in the echo of my bathroom, the only place where the sound didn't bounce off the broken ceiling. But every night, when I fell into my narrow bed with sugar still stuck under my nails, I whispered to myself. "One day, Vera. One day they'll see." And they did. But that's not today's part of the story. Today, we're still here, in my cramped rented room, with flour dust in my hair, my mother's tearful voice on the line, my uncle's laughter still rattling my skull like an old bell. The city lights flicker through my greasy window, mocking me. My bank account hovers close to zero. But in my head, I can already see it, the soft swirl of cream, the delicate sugar flowers, the faces of people biting into my cakes and forgetting, if only for a moment, how heavy life can be. This is where I began. And if you'd asked me then whether I'd ever see a helicopter hover over my old street, for me, I would have laughed too. But dreams have teeth. And mine were just starting to grow sharp. The second year was worse than the first, not because I wasn't working, but because I was working too much for almost nothing in return. The same people who laughed at me suddenly wanted free samples for their kid's birthday or their cousin's wedding. "Vera, make me a cake, I'll tell everyone about you," they'd say, patting my shoulder like they were doing me a favor. I smiled, nodded, said yes, and then watched them forget my name when it came time to pay. My days turned into a blur of unpaid orders and promises that never turned into contracts. I baked in borrowed kitchens, my neighbors, my friends, once even in the back of a tiny canteen that belonged to my old cafe boss. He still called me Devchanka, little girl, as if I hadn't grown up and left his greasy counters behind. At night, I recorded my online classes in my tiny bathroom, balancing my phone on a stack of buckets to get the camera angle right. I'd talk into the cracked mirror, trying to keep my voice warm and cheerful while my own eyes looked back at me, tired, hungry, and half crazy. Every click, every upload felt like tossing a message in a bottle into a stormy ocean. Would someone buy it? Would they care? Or would I spend another week explaining to my mother why her daughter was still knob? Once, after a particularly bad month, I sat alone on my bathroom floor with my knees pressed to my chest. Flour and powdered sugar crusted the cuffs of my sweatpants. My phone battery blinked red on the sink. From the other side of the thin wall, my upstairs neighbor's baby screamed endlessly, like it was echoing my own thoughts. I didn't cry. I didn't even have tears left. I just sat there, breathing the sour air of mold and soap, telling myself, keep going, Vera. One more cake. One more video. One more day. I knew what people said about me behind closed doors. My mother, poor woman, tried to defend me at first, but soon even she gave up. When she called, she didn't ask how I was anymore. She asked when I'd stop humiliating the family. "Vera, your cousin Sasha works at the municipal office, he says they'll take you. You'll get paid every month, you'll get benefits. You can live like a normal girl, find a husband, stop these childish dreams." Her voice always cracked at dreams. She spat that word out like it was poison. But there was something in me, some sharp piece of iron that wouldn't bend, no matter how much they tried to hammer it flat. Every time they told me you can't, I felt the iron get hotter. Harder. Heavier in my chest. One night, in that same cramped bathroom, I scrolled through my messages and saw a single order request from a stranger, someone who'd found my tiny, ugly website by accident. A young mother who wanted a cake for her daughter's 5th birthday. She asked if I could make a unicorn castle, something bright and magical, because her little girl loved fairy tales. I didn't even have the tools. I didn't have the money for the fondant or the special molds. But I said yes. I borrowed cash from a friend, used my neighbor's oven again, and spent 36 hours awake, sculpting little towers and sugar flowers until my hands shook too hard to hold the piping bag. When I delivered it to the woman's tiny apartment, her daughter came running out in pink pajamas, squealing, "Mama, Mama, it's real." The mother hugged me at the door, pressing a crumpled envelope of cash into my hand like it was a sacred relic. She whispered, "Thank you, Vera. You made her dream real." That night, I walked home through the snow, my boots soaked through, but my head buzzing with something warm and bright. Maybe the whole world thought I was wasting my life, but for that little girl, for that one moment, I made magic real. And that was enough. It was tiny victories like that which carried me through the next months. Every time the tax office threatened me with papers I barely understood, every time a client disappeared without paying, every time my mother's tears turned to curses, I remembered that girl's smile. Bit by bit, word spread, quietly, not enough to feed me properly, but enough to keep the lights on. A birthday here, a baby shower there. A neighbor's cousin's wedding cake, done for half the price. And my online courses, still rough, still filmed on my cheap phone, started selling to a handful of people who messaged me from other towns. They asked me for tips, for recipes, for advice on how to start their own little dreams. I wrote back to every single one. Not because I thought I was some guru, but because I knew what it felt like to sit alone in a cold room, whispering one day to yourself when nobody believed in you. That second year blurred into the third. One long winter, one sticky summer. My hands grew rough, my eyes heavy, my dreams sharper than ever. I didn't have much, but I was still standing. And for me, that was enough. I told myself, one more step, Vera. One more cake. One more lesson. One day, they'll all hear it. The sound of your success. They'd hear it loud enough to drown out their laughter. But first, I needed to survive long enough to see that day come. The third year tested everything I had left inside me, my patience, my courage, my belief that I could make something real out of the flour-dusted scraps of my ambition. By then, my tiny rented room was more kitchen than bedroom, bags of sugar stacked next to my pillow, boxes of food coloring on my windowsill, piping tips and spatulas rattling in cracked mugs because I didn't even own proper drawers. I used to joke that I didn't sleep, I just napped between batches. But it wasn't really a joke. The worst part was the money. It trickled in just enough to keep me alive, and always threatened to stop at any moment. Every ruble that came in went straight out again: rent, ingredients, delivery, a new hand mixer when the old one caught fire in the middle of a test batch. I learned to live on stale bread and leftover frosting. Some nights, dinner was just warm tea with a spoon of condensed milk, the same flavor I'd loved as a child. Except now it tasted like debt. When things got really bad, I'd open my notebook, that same one I'd filled with crooked ideas in my cafe days, and read my scribbles out loud, like a prayer. Open my studio. Custom wedding cakes. Birthday cakes for the mayor's daughter. Deliver by helicopter. Back then, the last part made me laugh at myself. A helicopter? For cake? In our dusty little town where most people didn't even own a car? Ridiculous. But still, I left it on the page. I started to gather my first real clients, the ones who didn't want free samples or discounts for promotion. An office manager who ordered cupcakes for her boss's anniversary. A young couple who found me online and asked for a 2-tier cake with fresh flowers. A local blogger who offered to feature my desserts if I'd let her film the process. Each small order chipped away at my fear. I still lost sleep. I still lost money. But I started to see glimpses of the life I wanted, in the thank you messages, the photos of families cutting into my cakes, the stories they'd tell about how people gasped when they saw my sugar roses and spun chocolate crowns. It felt like a secret rebellion. Every cake I made was another brick I stole from the gray walls they'd tried to build around me. My mother, though, refused to see it. By then, she'd stopped pleading. She'd switched to insults, quiet but sharp. You're not normal, Vera. You're not a person anymore. A person works, a person has a pension, a person marries and has children. What do you have? Cakes? Sometimes she'd cry until I had to hang up, because if I didn't, I'd start crying too. But I didn't stop. I couldn't. There was nothing left for me back home but that stale smell of factory air and my uncle's cigarette smoke. I'd rather starve here, surrounded by cracked bowls and half-finished sugar sculptures, than let them drag me back to that. Halfway through that third year, I found an old, half-abandoned cafe for rent on the edge of town. The sign above the door was missing letters. The windows were taped over from the inside, dusty and yellowed. But the rent was cheap, unbelievably cheap. So cheap that I suspected it might fall apart around me the second I signed the contract. I scraped together what little I had left, borrowed the rest from a friend who trusted me more than I trusted myself, and signed the papers with trembling hands. It didn't look like much, and honestly, it wasn't. The first month I spent sleeping on the floor, surrounded by buckets of paint, broken chairs, and bags of cheap flour stacked next to my pillow like silent guardians. I cleaned, painted, scrubbed, painted again. I fixed the ovens myself, watched videos to figure out the plumbing when a pipe burst over my head at 3 a.m. I had no sign, no fancy counter, no barista to brew pretty lattes for selfies. But I had my cakes. And my cakes were enough. I'll never forget the day I opened my tiny door for the first time, the wooden frame stuck in the damp, and my makeshift open sign was just cardboard scrawled in red marker. I stood there in my flour-dusted apron, breathing in the smell of buttercream and cheap fresh paint, and told myself, this is mine. Nobody can take this away. Of course, nobody rushed in that first day. Or the second. Or the third. For a week, I sat behind my battered counter, practicing rose petals out of leftover fondant and waving awkwardly at people who peeked through the dusty window but didn't come inside. I could hear them outside sometimes, the neighbors who walked by, the same ones who'd told my mother I'd never amount to anything. They'd press their noses to the glass and whisper. Look at her. Wasting her life. She'll be gone by winter. Who buys fancy cakes here anyway? Maybe they were right. But every time I thought about giving up, I pictured that tiny scribble in my old notebook, deliver by helicopter. If I could dream that big once, I could hold on a little longer. And so I did. I stayed open. I baked. I waited. I whispered to myself. One more day, Vera. One more cake. One more chance for someone to see you. And then, someone did. I remember the day that someone finally walked in like I remember every sugar flower I've ever piped by hand, crisp, perfect in my mind, a tiny miracle I can taste if I close my eyes. It was raining, that cold, needling spring rain that soaks you through your sleeves and your shoes no matter how fast you run. I was behind my little counter, practicing lettering on parchment scraps with leftover royal icing, pretending not to notice the water dripping through the corner of my patched-up ceiling. I'd nearly dozed off when the door creaked. At first, I thought it was the wind, but then the bell above the door rang, that cheap little bell I'd found in a flea market bin for 10 rubles. I looked up. She was maybe 25, wearing a cheap plastic raincoat, her hair plastered to her forehead. In her hands was a bright blue umbrella turned inside out by the wind. She stood just inside the door, dripping rain onto my dusty floor. For a heartbeat, neither of us said anything. I wiped my hands on my apron and tried to smile like I wasn't one rent payment away from packing this all up in cardboard boxes. She cleared her throat. Her voice was soft but steady. Hi. Are you Vera? I nearly laughed. Who else would I be? Who else would be standing behind this counter, under a leaking ceiling, surrounded by half-finished cakes and dreams? Yes, I said. I'm Vera. How can I help you? She looked down at her umbrella, twisting the broken spokes with nervous fingers. My sister's birthday is next week. She loves fairies. And mushrooms. Like a little forest, you know? She trailed off, glancing around my bare walls and scratched tables. I saw the doubt flicker in her eyes. Maybe she expected glass cases full of colorful pastries, fancy chairs, soft music. Instead, she got peeling paint and the smell of wet plaster. Still, she didn't run away. She took a breath. Could you make a cake like that? I didn't hesitate. I'd never made a forest cake. I'd never made edible mushrooms or spun sugar moss. But I nodded like I'd done it 100 times. Of course, I said. Tell me exactly what she loves. I'll make it happen. Her shoulders dropped. She smiled, a shy, hopeful thing that cracked something open in my tired chest. She came closer, pulled a folded bill from her pocket, and pressed it into my palm. Not the full price, just a deposit, but enough to cover flour, sugar, a new batch of fondant. I promised her I'd make it magical. She promised she'd tell everyone if she liked it. When she left, the bell above the door chimed again, sweeter than it ever had before. I turned that cake into my whole life for the next 3 days. I barely slept, just snatched 20-minute naps curled on the flour sack in the corner. I built tiny toadstools out of red fondant, painted white speckles by hand. I piped sugar leaves, spun edible vines, brushed the cake layers with green matcha so the forest floor would look alive when they sliced it open. When she came back to pick it up, she gasped so loud I nearly burst into tears right there. She pulled out her phone, took 100 photos from every angle. It's perfect, she whispered. She's going to lose her mind. She paid the rest without a word of bargaining. She hugged me at the door, a stranger hugging another stranger, but in that squeeze I felt my dream hum like a heartbeat. I watched her hurry off through the wet street, balancing my forest cake like a crown. I imagined her sister's face when she opened the box. I imagined the laughter, the flash of photos, the sugar mushrooms disappearing into giggling mouths. And the next day, the messages started coming. A friend of hers wanted a cake too. Then another. And another. Small orders, but each one a seed pressed into the soil of my dusty, leaking shop. Soon, I could afford to fix the hole in the ceiling. I replaced my old oven with a battered second-hand one that at least didn't short-circuit every other week. I scraped my walls clean and painted them bright white, so my cakes would look like jewels against them. And still, the laughter behind my back didn't stop. My uncle came by once. He leaned in the doorway, took a long drag of his cigarette, flicked the ash onto my clean floor. So, what, you're still at this, huh? Cakes. You think sugar's going to pay your pension? I didn't bother arguing. I just offered him a box of leftover cupcakes, the ones that hadn't sold that day. He took them, muttering about how I should come home, find a husband, get a real job. He never thanked me for the cakes. But it didn't matter. I had my forest cake girl. I had her friends. I had people taking photos of my work and tagging me online. My cheap phone buzzed at night with new messages. Hi, Vera, my cousin said you're amazing. Can you make something for my son's birthday? I said yes to every order, no matter how tired I was, no matter how late the nights stretched. I learned to say yes first, panic later. By the end of that third year, my notebook wasn't a fantasy anymore. It was a blueprint. One line at a time. Open my studio. Build my name. Deliver by helicopter. That last line still made me smile. But I didn't cross it out. Not yet. Because in the quiet of my little shop, under my flickering lights, I could almost hear it, the faint, distant sound of blades cutting through the sky. And I knew, someday, they'd hear it too. I remember exactly when my business stopped being just my stubborn little secret and started to look like something real, something big enough to make even my uncle shut up for a second. It happened in the middle of my 4th year, a season of endless cakes and endless storms. It rained so much that spring that the roof of my tiny shop started leaking again, no matter how many buckets I set under the drips. But I didn't have time to fix it, there were too many orders to fill, too many people to answer, too many cakes to finish before the next pickup. By then, I had regulars. Mothers who came back every year for their kids' birthdays. Young couples who trusted me with their wedding cakes. Teenagers who saved pocket money for fancy cupcakes they could post on their feeds. Every week, someone new knocked on my door and said the same words. You made my sister's cake. You did my friend's baby shower. I saw your cakes online, can you do one for me? Every time, I said yes. I never said no, not to a customer, not to a design, not to an impossible idea. If they wanted a cake shaped like a piano, I made piano keys out of dark chocolate. If they wanted edible flowers in the middle of January, I found a way to ship the petals or made sugar ones so real they fooled their mothers. Of course, I was still alone. No team. No assistant. No cashier. Just me, Vera, the girl they called lazy and dreamer and broke. The same girl who now worked 15, 18, 20-hour days to keep her doors open. One morning, after I'd pulled an all-nighter finishing a 4-tier engagement cake covered in sugar orchids, I found myself asleep on the shop floor. I woke up with my cheek pressed to cold tile, the taste of buttercream in my hair. I lay there for a moment, staring up at the ceiling, listening to the faint drip-drip of the leak above my head. I could hear my mother's voice in my mind. You're not normal. You're not a person. A person doesn't live like this. Maybe she was right. But I didn't want to be normal anymore. That same week, I got the message that changed everything. It came from a local event planner, someone I'd never met, but who'd heard about me through 3 different people. She wrote in neat, formal sentences, every line sprinkled with polite flattery that made me suspicious at first. People only talk like that when they want something they're afraid you'll refuse. She asked for a meeting. Said it was a special project. No details. Just a time and place, a fancy cafe downtown where I'd never dared to set foot before. I nearly didn't go. I had cakes to finish, rent to pay, a leaking roof to argue with. But curiosity has always been my worst weakness, so I cleaned the sugar dust off my shoes, scraped buttercream off my elbows, and went anyway. The cafe was everything my shop wasn't: warm, expensive, full of soft chairs and shiny glass display cases. Nobody there looked like they knew what it felt like to scrape burnt cake off the bottom of a cheap oven at 2 in the morning. I almost turned back at the door. But the planner spotted me, a sleek woman in a gray blazer with perfect hair and a notebook that probably cost more than my rent. She waved me over like she'd been expecting me all her life. Her name was Olga. She got straight to the point. A wedding, she said, flipping her notebook open to a page of scribbled notes. Big. Private. Very important clients. They want custom cakes, full dessert tables, something special, something no one here can do except you. I laughed when she said that, an actual laugh that startled a couple drinking lattes behind me. Me? The only one? In this city full of bakeries with better ovens, better shops, better reputations? But Olga didn't flinch. She tapped her pen on my name, written in neat block letters. They asked around. Your name came up. Over and over. People remember your cakes, Vera. They remember you. I sat there in that soft chair, surrounded by the warm smell of expensive coffee, and for the first time in years, I let myself believe that maybe, just maybe, all those sleepless nights were worth it. The wedding was for a young couple from the capital, people with money, real money. They wanted everything flown out to a private estate just outside the city. They wanted a cake big enough to feed 100 guests, plus towers of pastries, macarons, tiny tarts, sugar sculptures, a dessert table that would look like a fairy tale in every Instagram photo. And they wanted it delivered by helicopter. When Olga said the word, I nearly choked on my watery cafe coffee. A helicopter? I asked. For cake? She smiled like it was the most normal thing in the world. They don't want the cake to ride in the back of some dusty van for hours. They want it fresh, beautiful, an entrance. They'll pay. And they'll pay you. I stared at her, my mind racing back to my battered old notebook, that scribbled dream that always made me laugh at myself. Deliver by helicopter. She handed me the contract. My hand shook so badly I nearly spilled coffee on the page. The number written there was more money than I'd ever seen at one time. Enough to fix my roof 100 times over. Enough to hire real help. Enough to breathe. I signed it without reading the fine print. I'd learned by then that if life cracks open a door for you, you don't waste time checking if the hinges are oiled. You kick it open with your whole heart. When I walked out of that cafe, the rain had stopped. For the first time in years, the sky over my gray little city looked like it was clearing. Back in my shop, I stood under the leaking roof, my fingers pressed to the cold tile, and whispered to myself. One day, Vera. One day they'll hear you. And this time, I believed it. After I signed the contract with Olga, everything else around me turned to static. I could still hear the drip of the leak in my ceiling, still smell the sugar and flour that clung to my clothes, still feel the bruises on my knuckles from too many nights spent kneading fondant until my arms ached, but all of it blurred behind that single thought, they want a helicopter for my cake. It felt like a joke I'd whispered only to myself all these years, and now the world had heard it and answered, all right, Vera. Let's see if you can do it. The couple wanted a wedding that would outshine every other wedding in our region for the next 10 years. Olga sent me lists, mood boards, Pinterest links dripping with pastel flowers, crystal towers, sugar pearls. They wanted the cake to look like a snow palace, delicate but huge, 5 tiers at least, with edible lace, hand-painted details, sugar flowers that looked like they'd just been plucked from a royal greenhouse. And it had to survive the helicopter ride. I barely slept that first week. I spent whole nights sketching designs on the back of old invoices, calculating sugar ratios and structural supports. I watched videos on how to stabilize tall cakes for transport, not just a bumpy van ride but a flight over fields and forests. Every mistake I'd made in the past, every cracked fondant edge, every sugar flower that collapsed in humidity, turned into a lesson I clutched like a life raft. There could be no mistakes this time. I called in every favor I had. I asked my neighbor's nephew, an amateur carpenter, to help me build sturdy cake boards and support rods. I borrowed a bigger oven from a pastry chef I'd once lent money to when his mixer broke. He raised an eyebrow when I told him what I was baking for. A helicopter, he repeated, laughing so loud he nearly dropped his measuring cup. What's next, Vera? You delivering cupcakes by submarine? Maybe, I said, dead serious. I think that's when he realized I wasn't the same girl who used to beg him for leftover oven time. He didn't laugh again after that. When I told my mother about the wedding, she didn't believe me. A helicopter, she scoffed over the phone. They'll cancel. Or they'll find someone proper, not you. You'll see. I didn't argue. I just let her words settle like dust on a shelf I never cleaned. My uncle dropped by my shop again, pretending he was just in the neighborhood. He leaned against my counter, flicking his lighter open and shut like a nervous tick. Vera, you sure you can handle this? You mess up, you'll embarrass yourself. And us. I smiled so wide my cheeks hurt. Don't worry, uncle. If I fail, you'll be the first to know. He didn't like that answer. He left with free cookies anyway. Some things never change. The weeks crawled by in a blur of buttercream and stress. I tested every element 5 times over. I practiced making sugar lace until my fingers cracked from the delicate piping. I slept on the floor of my studio with my apron for a blanket and the smell of fondant for company. I didn't have money for fancy delivery boxes, so I made my own, thick, layered cardboard lined with foam to hold every piece steady. I designed the cake to be assembled in 2 stages, lower tiers stacked and doweled together, upper tiers attached on site. Every flower was wired and boxed like fragile glass. When the wedding day finally came, I was so tired I felt hollowed out. But my eyes were clear, my hands steady. My shop smelled like vanilla and sugar pearls. The cake sat on my biggest table, shimmering under my flickering ceiling light like a promise I'd made to myself years ago. When the helicopter landed, not at the wedding venue yet, but in the empty field behind my shop for pickup, the whole neighborhood came outside. Mothers with babies, old men in slippers, kids in slippers and mismatched jackets, all of them standing in the muddy grass, shielding their eyes against the wind as the blades cut the sky open. My uncle was there too. He lit a cigarette but forgot to smoke it, just stared at the helicopter like it had come from another planet. And my mother, she didn't come to see me off, but I knew she was peeking from behind her curtains in our old house, the one I hadn't set foot in for years. When the pilot stepped out, a man in a spotless jacket with a bored expression, I felt my knees nearly give out. He looked at me, at my shop, at my cake boxes. Then he shrugged. Is that it? I wanted to scream, yes, that's it, that's my whole life in sugar and sponge and dreams and sleepless nights. But I just nodded. Yes. That's it. He loaded the boxes carefully, under my sharp, frantic instructions. I made him promise, 3 times, to keep the flight smooth, to secure the tiers exactly as I'd shown him. He gave me a thumbs up like he'd done this 100 times. Maybe he had. But I hadn't. When they lifted off, the wind from the blades blew sugar dust off my sleeves and into the street. The kids cheered. The mothers clutched their coats. My uncle's cigarette finally fell from his lips, smoldering in the mud. Above all that noise, I heard my own heartbeat in my ears, louder than the blades, louder than my mother's old curses, louder than my doubts. They're laughing now, I thought, staring up at that bright spot in the sky carrying my cake away. But soon they won't be. I didn't know yet what the wedding would look like, how the guests would gasp, how the bride would cry when she saw her sugar palace touch down like a blessing from the clouds. But I knew one thing for sure. That helicopter was the sound of my dream taking off, loud enough that even my small town couldn't ignore it anymore. When the helicopter disappeared beyond the rooftops, the neighborhood stayed frozen for a moment, like they were waiting for something else to happen. Maybe they expected it to come back with my cake smashed to crumbs. Maybe they thought it would drop out of the sky altogether. But nothing fell. Nothing broke. The sky stayed empty and quiet, except for the faint echo of the rotors fading into the horizon. I turned back to my shop, my tiny, scraped-together kingdom. The sugar dust was still settling on the threshold where the wind had blown it. I could see my reflection in the cracked window, flour on my collar, hair pulled back with a plastic clip, cheeks hollow from too many nights awake. I looked like a girl who should have given up years ago. But my phone buzzed in my pocket before I could even lock the door behind me. It was Olga. The cake is perfect. They love it. Stay close to your phone, they want to talk to you after the wedding. I read that message 5 times, standing in the middle of my empty shop. The same shop that had once been just 4 walls, peeling paint, and a hole in the ceiling that dripped rain on my shoulders while I piped buttercream roses. Now it was a studio that had just sent a sugar palace into the sky. I didn't cry, I thought I would. But instead I laughed, sudden and sharp, loud enough that the kids still standing in the muddy yard turned and stared at me. Let them stare. Let them run home to tell their mothers, their fathers, my mother, Vera's laughing like she owns the world. Maybe because for the first time I felt like a tiny piece of it actually did belong to me. I didn't sleep that night, either, but not because of cakes, or videos to record, or broken ovens to fix. I sat on the floor behind my counter with my back against the cold wall, phone in my hand, waiting for more messages. They came in slow at first, a thank you from Olga, a photo of the cake set up at the wedding, glinting under chandeliers. Then more, photos of the bride, tears in her eyes as she touched the sugar flowers I'd piped with my cracked hands. A shot of the helicopter on the lawn, the cake carried out like treasure. Then the Real flood came. The guests, wealthy people from the capital, people who'd never set foot in my dusty little town before, started posting photos, videos, stories tagged with my name. Who made this cake? Where did it come from? Can you believe this was flown in by helicopter? The next morning, I woke to my phone vibrating off the counter. Messages from people I didn't know, people I'd never dreamed would care about me. Wedding planners from other cities. A restaurant chain asking if I did luxury dessert tables. A magazine wanting to write about the girl who flew her cake in by helicopter. I didn't know what to answer first. I sat there, my back aching from the cold floor, my legs numb, my hair a greasy mess, and laughed again, quietly this time. Outside my window, I saw them, the same neighbors who'd whispered for years that I'd fail. They were standing in clumps by the gate, peering through the glass. Some pretended they were just out for a walk. Others pointed at my sign, at the old cafe door I'd scrubbed and painted myself when I couldn't afford a real signboard. I opened the door, pretending not to notice them. A few pretended not to notice me, too, suddenly fascinated by their own shoes, or the cracks in the pavement. One neighbor, a woman who'd once told my mother I was eating her pension alive, cleared her throat, loud enough for me to hear. "So, Vera, you're still doing these cakes, huh? Busy, I hear." I met her eyes. Smiled that same wide, polite smile I'd learned to wear like armor. "Yes. Busy." She nodded, awkwardly clutching her plastic shopping bag. I could see it in her eyes, the question she didn't want to ask but couldn't help herself from wondering. How much did that helicopter cost? How much did they pay her? I didn't say anything. I didn't owe her an explanation. Inside, the studio looked like the same four walls it had always been, but it didn't feel the same anymore. It felt bigger, brighter, like it was breathing with me for the first time. I flipped the battered open sign on the door, just like any other day. By lunch, I had 3 new orders confirmed. 2 more messages blinking unread. A call from Olga asking if I'd be interested in another big wedding, this time in the capital, double the guests, triple the budget. I laughed again. Said yes before she could finish her pitch. By evening, my uncle showed up, this time without a cigarette, without the fake casual swagger he always wore like an old coat. He stepped inside, awkward as a boy, looking around like he'd never really seen my place before. He didn't congratulate me. He didn't apologize for the years he'd called me a fool, a lazy girl, a burden on my mother's back. He just stood there, clearing his throat, running a hand over his stubble. You got any leftover cake today?" he asked. I wanted to snap at him. I wanted to say, "No, uncle. No more free cake for you." But instead, I reached under the counter, pulled out a box of scraps from the test batch I'd made the night before. I handed it to him with that same polite smile. "Don't eat it all at once," I said. He took it without looking me in the eye, muttered a gruff thank you, and left. I stood there, hands on the counter, the empty shop around me humming like it was alive. I could almost hear it, the echo of rotor blades, the quiet roar of something bigger than my little dream finally lifting off the ground. For the first time, I didn't feel like a fool for hearing that sound. The days after the wedding blurred together like sugar melting into hot tea, sweet and warm but impossible to separate into clear moments. One morning bled into the next. I slept in snatches, waking to the buzz of new messages, new requests, new names I'd never heard before now asking for me. People who'd never said a word to me in years suddenly remembered they were my friends. Girls who used to smirk when I said I wouldn't go work on the line at the factory now popped up in my inbox asking if I needed helpers. Helpers, that was new. I'd always done everything alone. My stubborn pride had kept my shop a one-woman battlefield, my hands on every whisk, every spatula, every sugar rose. But when the helicopter photos spread online like pollen in spring, the trickle of orders became a flood I couldn't hold back alone. It terrified me more than it thrilled me. I made myself hire my first real assistant, a shy student named Lena who'd messaged me 5 times before I finally called her in. She stood in the doorway on her first day, clutching her phone like a lifeline. "You're sure?" she asked, eyes wide. "I've never piped a rose in my life." I laughed, really laughed, not that tight, polite smile I gave the neighbors. "Don't worry," I said, handing her an apron. "You'll be piping roses in your dreams by next week." With Lena at my side, my little studio felt different, busier, warmer. We worked shoulder to shoulder under the flickering lights, brushing powdered sugar from our cheeks, playing old songs on my phone to drown out the clank of the leaking pipes we still hadn't fixed. She learned fast. By the second month, she could smooth fondant better than I ever had at her age. She was gentle where I was fierce, soft where I was sharp, but she cared, and I needed someone who cared. When we rolled out the next batch of online courses, Lena stayed up with me through the night, holding the tripod steady while I piped borders on dummy cakes and pretended not to hear my own voice shaking. Together, we packed boxes late into the night, giggling like teenagers when the sugar flowers toppled over and we had to start again. Sometimes I'd catch her staring at me, eyes wide. Once she said, voice so quiet I almost didn't hear, "Vera, did you ever think it would be like this?" I didn't answer her honestly, not all of it. Because the truth was, I had thought about it, exactly like this. I'd seen it so many nights when I was alone on my bathroom floor with my phone balanced on a paint bucket, the studio, the cakes, the orders flooding in, the roof that didn't leak anymore. I'd seen it all. I just hadn't told anyone because nobody would have believed it. A few months after the helicopter wedding, I got another call from Olga, this time with a request that nearly knocked the piping bag from my hand. "Vera," she said, voice brisk as ever, "how do you feel about corporate contracts?" I laughed. "I don't. Should I?" She didn't laugh back. "You should. One of the big hotel chains saw the wedding photos. They want to offer you an exclusive deal, custom dessert tables for every VIP event. Private jets, corporate anniversaries, weddings for people who don't ask the price, they want you. Only you." I dropped the phone. Literally. It clattered across my sugar-dusted counter and landed in a tray of gum paste leaves. Lena jumped like I'd fired a gun. I picked it up, heart hammering so hard I thought they'd hear it through the line. "You're serious?" "As a heart attack," Olga said. "Are you ready?" I wanted to say no. I wanted to say absolutely not, because how could a girl from a gray town, who learned to pipe flowers in a borrowed bathroom at 3 in the morning, ever be ready for something like this? But instead I said what I'd always said when the next impossible step appeared. Yes. After that, I didn't see my bed for days. My kitchen turned into a mini factory. Lena's sister joined us for the weekends, folding pastry boxes until her fingers blistered. My neighbor, the one who used to lend me her oven, dropped by with fresh herbs and leftover berries from her garden, silent offerings for the girl they'd once whispered about. My mother stayed quiet. She still called sometimes, but she didn't ask me to come home anymore. She didn't cry. She didn't scold. She just listened to me talk, about orders, about deliveries, about late nights and helicopters and hotels with polished marble floors that I tiptoed across like I didn't belong. Sometimes I heard her sigh on the other end, a small, secret sound. I wondered if she ever told my uncle what I'd built, if she ever bragged when nobody could hear. I wondered if she ever stood at her window when the helicopter thundered over our street and thought, "That's my daughter." One night, after Lena went home, I sat alone in my shop that was too small now for what I was becoming. My phone lay open on my old notebook. I flipped through the pages, fingertips brushing the worn lines where my dreams were scribbled in cramped, crooked handwriting. Open my studio. Make dream cakes. Teach people. Deliver by helicopter. I traced that last line with my thumb and laughed, not bitter, not tired, but bright and sharp, the way a knife feels when it finally slides clean through fondant. They'd heard my helicopter. They'd seen my sugar palace. And they hadn't laughed this time, or maybe they had, but now it didn't matter. The joke was on them now. The winter after the helicopter wedding was the first winter I didn't dread in years. No more shaking behind my counter wondering if I'd pay rent. No more scrubbing sugar off my neighbor's floor at midnight, apologizing for borrowing her oven yet again. Now, when the cold came, it came with orders. Orders for holiday cakes, towering Christmas trees of meringue and spun sugar, gingerbread houses so intricate they looked like tiny kingdoms under glass. Big hotels wanted my desserts for their VIP guests. Young couples booked me months in advance. People who'd once scoffed at my prices now begged to pay double to squeeze in an extra cake before New Year's Eve. I didn't sleep much, but now it was the good kind of sleepless, the kind that came with purpose. My mother stopped asking me when I'd get a real job. She didn't say "I'm proud of you," not once. But sometimes, if I called late at night, I'd hear voices in the background, her friends, my old neighbors, and I'd hear her say in that careful tone, "Yes, Vera's busy. She's doing her cakes. Important people order from her now, you know." She said it like she still didn't quite believe it herself, but like she wanted to. I let her keep that careful pride. I didn't push her for more. By January, the little studio that had once felt too big for just me was suddenly far too small for the orders stacked on my phone. Lena worked beside me every day after class, her sleeves dusted white with powdered sugar. Her sister stayed late on weekends. Sometimes their mother came by with soup and bread rolls, fussing over us like we were her own daughters. I couldn't keep turning away work. So I did the thing that made my stomach twist into knots. I signed a lease for a second location. A bigger studio, more ovens, more space, more counters, bright white tiles instead of peeling paint. When I told my mother, she was quiet for a long time. Then she said, very softly, "Vera, you won't lose it all, will you?" It was the only time she ever said out loud that she remembered those early days, the nights she cried when I didn't come home, the rumors that I was nothing but a failure, a girl who refused to get in line like everyone else. "I won't lose it, Mama," I told her. And for the first time I knew it was true. Opening the second studio felt like tearing my old self in two, the girl who piped sugar roses until her hands cracked and the woman who now signed delivery contracts with men in crisp suits who pretended they didn't notice the buttercream on my sleeves. We hired 2 more girls. Then a part-time delivery driver. Then a photographer to redo my website, the same site I'd once cobbled together at 3 in the morning between unpaid orders. Lena joked we should start wearing uniforms. I laughed, then I ordered aprons embroidered with my name. Vera Studio. Seeing it stitched in neat letters made something crack wide open in my chest. Orders kept coming. Engagements, banquets, company parties, baby showers for influencers who posted my cakes to thousands of followers who'd never heard of my gray little town until now. One night, as the snow fell thick outside my second studio's bright windows, I stood alone by the counter, tracing my fingertips over a cake stand I'd once begged my old cafe boss to lend me for a single photo shoot. Now I own dozens, all lined up in clean glass cabinets that caught the warm light. I heard a tap at the window. For a second, I thought I imagined it, but then I saw him, my uncle, standing outside in his worn coat, stamping snow off his boots. I opened the door before he could knock twice. He looked around my new studio, the polished counters, the rows of perfect pastries boxed for delivery. He tried to smirk the way he always had, but it looked forced now, brittle around the edges. "You really did it, huh?" he said finally. He didn't look at me when he said it, just stared at the sugar flowers piped along the display. A helicopter, and now all this. Who'd have thought? I didn't answer him. He didn't need my answer. He just nodded at the counter. "Got any leftover cake?" he asked, like he always did. I reached behind me, pulled out a slice wrapped in clean parchment, tied with a neat ribbon. Not scraps this time, a perfect wedge from a perfect cake I could afford to give away now, just because I felt like it. He took it, nodded, and shuffled back into the snow without another word. No congratulations, no apology, but I didn't need those either. He'd heard the helicopter. He'd seen the bright lights of my second studio. That was enough. When he left, I stood at the window for a long moment, watching the snow swallow his figure. Then I turned back inside, to my ovens, my counters, my girls piping tiny blossoms in neat rows, our laughter echoing through the bright, warm room. I thought about that line in my old notebook, "Deliver by helicopter." The joke that used to make me laugh when I had nothing else to hold on to. I'd done it. And now the sound of those blades still hummed in my bones, a promise I carried everywhere. By the time spring returned, my second studio felt less like a risk and more like a stepping stone. I didn't wake up terrified anymore that it would all vanish overnight, not when my calendar was booked solid for months, not when people traveled from other towns just to pick up a box of my pastries and take photos under the sign with my name stitched in bright white letters, Vera Studio. Lena kept pace with me, sleeves dusted in sugar, hair pulled back with a crooked clip that reminded me so much of my own early days it made my chest ache in the best way. Her sister stayed on full-time now too. I hired 2 more girls to pack orders, answer calls, smooth fondant. I found an old friend from my cafe days to run deliveries. When the big hotel contract came through, steady, monthly dessert tables for every high-end event they hosted, I didn't even hesitate before signing it. I didn't have to. There was no voice in my head anymore whispering maybe you can't. The helicopter was the start, but by then, it wasn't the loudest thing people heard about me. Now they heard about the sugar castles I built for celebrity parties. About the rainbow towers for charity galas. About the online courses that reached far beyond my dusty little town, teaching women in other small cities how to make their own first crooked rose, just like I once did in my mother's tiny kitchen. And they heard the sound that echoed even louder than any helicopter, the quiet clink of money in my accounts. The buzz of clients waiting weeks for my free days. The hum of my name, spoken with a tone I'd never heard before, not mockery, not pity, but respect. Sometimes envy. Sometimes awe. Once, when my mother called, she asked if she could come see the new studio. She came on a Saturday, standing awkwardly by the door in her old gray coat, the same one I'd grown up burying my face in when I was small. She looked around at the bright space, the shelves stacked with polished cake stands, the neat boxes tied with ribbons, my girls working in the background, laughing as they piped roses and packed orders. She touched the sign on the wall, Dara Studio, running her fingers over the letters like she could hardly believe they were real. She didn't cry. She didn't say I'm sorry for all those nights she called me a fool, a dreamer, a freeloader who'd come crawling home any day now. Instead, she turned to me with her tired eyes that had watched me leave that tiny flat above the grocery store all those years ago and never come back the same. "You did all this?" she asked softly. I nodded. "I didn't say yes, Mama. I did it when nobody believed in me, when you were sure I'd come crawling back. There was no need for that now." The hum of mixers in the back, the scent of fresh pastries, the soft laughter of my team, that was my answer. She stayed for a cup of tea at my little table in the corner, the same battered table I'd bought secondhand when I couldn't afford anything else. She drank slowly, eyes roaming the walls, the shelves, the racks of finished cakes lined up like tiny sculptures waiting for their next flight out the door. When she left, she squeezed my shoulder. Her hand was rough, work-worn like mine used to be when I did everything alone. She didn't say the words "I'm proud of you." She didn't have to. I heard them anyway. Later that week, I got another call from Olga. Another wedding, bigger than the first, a couple from the city who wanted to land their celebration outside town, somewhere green, somewhere far from the gossip and the concrete. "They want something special," Olga said, voice crisp, brisk, always moving. "A grand entrance. Something people will remember." I didn't even flinch when she said it this time. "They want the helicopter again, don't they?" I asked, grinning into the phone. She laughed, a rare sound from Olga, who never wasted time on nonsense. "They do. I told them it's your signature now." "My signature?" "A helicopter." A sound so loud it drowned out every whisper, every neighbor's smirk, every uncle's dry laugh about how Vera will be back on the line in no time. When the day came, I stood out back again, watching the blades slice the air above my second studio. This time there was no uncertainty twisting my stomach into knots, just a quiet, fierce thrill humming through my bones. The neighbors still came out to watch. Kids on bikes, old men in slippers, mothers shielding their hair from the rotor wash. Somewhere in that little crowd, I knew my mother stood too, behind her curtain maybe, or maybe right there on the sidewalk, arms crossed, watching her daughter's cakes lift off the ground in a private chariot of steel and wind. I didn't wave at them. I didn't explain. I didn't need to. The helicopter rose, carrying not just sponge and sugar but every sleepless night I'd survived, every whisper I'd ignored, every promise I'd made to myself when I was just a stubborn girl with a broken oven and a dream that tasted like stale tea and sweet condensed milk. I turned back inside before it vanished over the rooftops. My girls were already laughing, cleaning counters, prepping the next batch of sugar flowers for tomorrow's orders. My phone buzzed with new messages, new clients, new dreams to build, new impossible requests I'd say yes to before my doubt could catch up. And above the hum of mixers, the clink of glass, the rustle of parchment and ribbons, I heard it clear as day, the soft echo of the blades fading into the sky. I wondered if they could still hear it too, my mother, my uncle, the neighbors who once whispered that I'd amount to nothing. "Can you hear it now?" I wanted to ask them. "Can you hear what success sounds like when it finally lifts off?" Because I could. And I always would.